Alex tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the sleek black car glided through the winding driveway of the Carter estate. His days had long become a rhythm of monotony, chauffeuring Mr. Carter to endless meetings and Emily, his wife, to social events she seemed less and less interested in attending. Despite her outward elegance, Emily's eyes often betrayed her. There was a sorrow there, something Alex couldn't ignore. The house was grand, cold, and quiet, much like Mr. Carter himself. A man consumed by ambition, he spoke to Alex only in commands and glanced at Emily as though she were just another accessory to his success. It was during one of these silent moments in the car, with Mr. Carter glued to his phone in the back seat, that Alex first noticed how Emily stared out the window. She wasn't looking at anything specific, just the passing trees, her face a mixture of wistfulness and something deeper, resignation, perhaps. One afternoon, Alex was tasked with driving Emily alone to a charity luncheon. She'd asked him to stop for coffee on the way, and as they waited in the car for her order, she broke the silence that had always hung between them. "Do you ever feel trapped, Alex?" she asked softly, not meeting his eyes. Caught off guard, Alex hesitated before replying. "Sometimes, ma'am. But I try not to think about it too much." Her laugh was short and dry. "That's wise. Thinking about it only makes it worse." She paused, then added, "It must be nice, though, to have the kind of life where you can just drive away whenever you want." Alex didn't know how to respond, so he stayed quiet, but her words lingered with him long after they returned home. Over the next few weeks, Emily began to open up in small ways. She'd ask Alex about his life, his family, his dreams. He answered cautiously at first, unsure if Mr. Carter would disapprove of such familiarity. But there was something disarming about Emily. She listened as though she truly cared. One evening, after dropping Mr. Carter at his office for yet another late meeting, Emily asked Alex to take her to the park. "Just for a little while," she said, her voice almost pleading. He obliged, parking near a quiet corner where she could sit unnoticed. As she stepped out and inhaled the cool night air, Alex followed at a respectful distance. She turned to him after a while, her expression soft. "Thank you, Alex, for this." He nodded, unsure what to say, but the look in her eyes felt heavier than gratitude. Later, as they drove back to the estate, the silence in the car was no longer uncomfortable. Instead, it felt charged, like the first tremor of something neither of them could quite name. Days turned into weeks, and their conversations became more personal, more layered. Emily no longer hesitated to speak her mind when it was just the two of them. She began to request Alex for errands that weren't strictly necessary, a scenic drive along the coast or a detour through the quieter parts of town. It wasn't about the destination, it was about the fleeting moments of freedom these drives seemed to offer her. One evening, as Alex waited for Emily outside a boutique, he caught sight of her through the glass window. She wasn't browsing or shopping, but simply standing there, lost in thought, staring at nothing in particular. When she returned to the car, she didn't say much, but her hand lingered on the door handle longer than usual before she climbed inside. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Alex finally asked, unable to hide his concern. She hesitated before responding, her voice quiet. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Alex glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her reflection hazy in the dim light. "Sometimes," he admitted, choosing his words carefully. "But I guess I've learned to make the best of what I have." Emily smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed a deeper sadness. "You're wiser than most people I know, Alex." A week later, during a long drive back from a late dinner party, rain began to pour relentlessly. The sound of the heavy drops against the windshield filled the silence between them. Emily was in the back seat, leaning her head against the window, her breath fogging up the glass. Suddenly, she spoke, her voice cutting through the rhythmic patter of the rain. "Pull over," she said. Alex obeyed, parking by the side of a quiet country road. The rain blurred the world outside, creating an intimate cocoon within the car. Emily shifted forward, her eyes meeting his in the rearview mirror. "Why are you always so kind to me?" she asked, her tone earnest. Alex turned slightly in his seat, caught off guard by the question. "I just think you deserve kindness," he replied simply. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, as if drawn by some unseen force, Emily leaned forward. Her hand brushed his shoulder, light as a whisper. "Thank you," she said, but the words carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. Before Alex could respond, she closed the space between them, pressing her lips to his. It was brief, almost hesitant, but it was enough to send a shockwave through them both. When she pulled away, her face was a mix of fear and exhilaration. "I'm sorry," she whispered, retreating to her seat. Alex stared at the steering wheel, his heart pounding. "You don't have to apologize," he said softly, though his mind was racing. The drive home was silent, but the air between them crackled with an unspoken understanding. Something had changed, and there was no going back. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act between restraint and longing. Emily became more reserved, her words carefully chosen, but her actions spoke louder than she realized. She lingered a little too long at the car door when Alex opened it for her. Her glances in the rearview mirror became more frequent, more meaningful. Alex, on the other hand, tried to maintain his composure, though it was clear the kiss had left him unsettled. He spent his nights replaying it in his mind, wondering what it meant and where it might lead. He knew the boundaries he was crossing, yet the thought of Emily's unhappiness weighed on him more heavily than his sense of duty. It wasn't long before others began to notice. The housekeeper, a woman who had worked for the Carters for years, gave Alex a knowing look one morning as he waited in the driveway. "Be careful," she muttered as she passed by, her tone laced with warning. Mr. Carter, too, had grown more observant. His usual disinterest in Emily's activities began to shift as he noticed her behavior changing. She was quieter during meals, distracted, her phone always within arm's reach. Once, he caught her smiling faintly at a message and asked, "Something amusing?" She quickly brushed it off, but the suspicion had already taken root. One evening, as Alex was preparing the car, Mr. Carter approached him unexpectedly. "Take care of her, Knight," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "She's been acting different." Alex nodded, masking his unease. "Of course, sir." The weight of those words stayed with him as he drove Emily to a gallery opening that night. When the event ended, she asked him to take a longer route home, her voice soft but insistent. "I need some air," she explained. As they drove through the quiet streets, Emily finally broke the silence. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. Alex hesitated. "No," he admitted. "But I know it wasn't right." She sighed, leaning her head back against the seat. "Right and wrong stopped mattering to me a long time ago," she said. The moment was interrupted by the sudden ring of Emily's phone. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's him," she said quietly, referring to her husband. She let the call go to voicemail, but the tension in the car grew palpable. By the time they arrived back at the estate, Mr. Carter was waiting at the door. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes narrowed as he watched Emily step out of the car, followed closely by Alex. "Late night?" he asked, his voice cool. Emily offered a vague excuse, but Alex could feel the man's gaze lingering on him. It was a look that carried more weight than words, a silent acknowledgement that something wasn't as it seemed. The next morning, Alex was called into Mr. Carter's office. "I don't like games," he said, his tone cold and deliberate. "Whatever is going on, it ends now." Alex left the room, knowing the walls were closing in. He wasn't sure how much longer this fragile arrangement could hold before it all came crashing down. Alex packed his few belongings into a worn duffel bag, his hands shaking as the weight of his decision pressed down on him. He had no choice. Mr. Carter's words from the night before were still ringing in his ears. "You're fired. Stay away from my wife." There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of redemption. Alex had crossed a line that could never be undone. Emily had watched from the upstairs window as Alex loaded his bag into the trunk of his car. She wanted to go to him, to beg him to stay, but what could she say? Her heart was torn between the comfort of the life she'd known and the passion she'd felt in Alex's presence. For a moment, she considered running away with him, leaving behind the cold emptiness of her marriage. But reality quickly settled in. The world she lived in wasn't built for such impulsive decisions. As Alex drove away, the silence in the car felt unbearable. He replayed every moment he'd shared with Emily, every stolen glance and quiet conversation. It had all felt so right in those moments, but now, all he could see were the cracks they'd left in their wake. His guilt weighed heavily on him, not just for betraying Mr. Carter, but for complicating Emily's already fragile world. Back at the estate, Emily confronted her husband for the first time in years. "Why are you so angry, Carter? Is it because you know I was looking for something you never gave me?" Mr. Carter's face hardened. "Don't make this about me, Emily. You humiliated me. You put everything we've built at risk." "What did we build, Carter?" She shot back, her voice trembling. "A life where we share a house but not a home? A marriage that's little more than a contract." For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of her words filling the space. Mr. Carter looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I'm not the one who broke our vows," he muttered. "No," Emily said softly. "You broke them long before Alex came into my life. You just didn't notice." Meanwhile, Alex found himself in a small motel on the outskirts of town, unsure of where to go next. His future felt uncertain, but one thing was clear: he couldn't stay. The life he'd built in the shadows of someone else's world was over. As he sat on the edge of the bed, he thought of Emily and the way she'd looked at him that last day. He wondered if she was thinking of him too. Weeks passed, and life moved on for both of them. Emily tried to mend the broken pieces of her marriage, though the cracks remained visible. Mr. Carter made efforts to reconnect, but the distance between them lingered. One afternoon, Emily found herself walking through the park where Alex had once taken her. She stopped at a bench, running her fingers over the worn wood, memories flooding back. She closed her eyes, the faint sound of his voice echoing in her mind. In another part of the city, Alex stood by his car, staring out at the horizon. He hadn't heard from Emily, nor had he expected to. Their lives were too different, too entangled in the expectations of others. But deep down, he knew he'd always carry a part of her with him. Their story had no neat ending, no clear resolution. It was a series of choices and consequences, of love found and lost. And as they each moved forward, they carried with them the knowledge that, for a brief moment, they had found something real, even if it wasn't meant to last.